Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bonson's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review. Did you know that what we're going to talk about right now is kind of the heart of the matter when it comes to economics? How do you talk about free markets? How do you talk about economics if we do not know what a market is, where a market comes from? And this topic is so foundationally important, and yet so constantly misconstrued, misunderstood, and not bothersome to me because of semantics, not bothersome to me because of vocabulary, but bothersome to me because it speaks to the heart of the matter. And I'm going to explain all this in our podcast today. The context of this, by the way, is that I had tweeted out last week a criticism of a rather shocking and disappointing position from Senator Josh Hawley of the great state of Missouri, defending the idea that we really need robust increase in Medicaid spending, and that's what populists signed up for, and we got to give it to them. And I alluded to the fact that this was not the conservative view, that we wanted some form of fiscal responsibility as market conservatives. And so there's, I have other criticisms that I've talked about in this podcast. There's a lot about Josh Hawley I like, by the way, but when it comes to markets, there's really become very little. And you might recall he did a podcast earlier in the year where he's co-authored a bill with Bernie Sanders to set a hard cap on what the amount of interest credit card companies can charge. And I tried to explain in the podcast the unintended consequences of this decision and how it really hurts the people they claim to help. But Senator Hawley's issues do come from the fact that he's fundamentally not a market conservative, and is very critical of what he refers to as market orthodoxy and market fundamentals and whatever. So somebody who I have no idea who they were came and put a comment up that I responded to because it's the heart of the matter. That this individual said, well, Hawley recognizes that markets are made politically, and conservatives are not willing to admit this, or too few of conservatives are willing to admit this. And this camp that this individual comes from, and certainly the camp Senator Hawley comes from, but really the kind of heart of the matter of this new right fad we're going through, which every day we get one day closer to its total implosion. But nevertheless, there's a school of thought right now that is uncomfortable with market fundamentals. I believe very much in the need for defending free enterprise. That's why I do this podcast. But I also believe in doing so with our defense of free enterprise rooted to something coherent and logical. And I talked about this last week, of the distinction between conservative economics and libertarian economics, that I do believe my side is not merely wanting to defend free enterprise against the new right that is down on a market economy, largely because they've kind of gotten tired of not getting everything they want, and they feel that if they just had the power, they could sort of impose it. But that my belief is, well, I do need to reject that idea, and I do need to defend market economy, but I do very much want to do so in the context of a virtuous society, and a view of markets that is rooted to creational truth and rooted to a view of the human person. But see, this gets down to what the definition of a market is. A market being humans acting. We have markets because humans act. Now, I believe that humans act because God made them to act. And these markets, physical places, virtual, essentially represent, you could say, buyers and sellers meeting to exchange goods and services. And then that from there is going to be up against laws of supply and demand. Prices are going to be determined between buyers and sellers in that scenario. But the thing I would say that takes place before you refer to a market as a place that buyers and sellers meet is markets exist because of the fact that humans act. And then out of their organic action, you do have a market because people are acting out of their God-given capacity to try to create a better scenario for themselves, to enhance their quality of life, to provide their own sustenance and the sustenance of their families. And that this natural instinct creates a market. Markets are basically created by humans. Humans were created by God. And the idea that a market is something that exists when the state imposes it. As this individual on Twitter said, markets exist because they're created by politics, made by politics. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, what am I not saying here? I am not, it is true, I hold to a spontaneous order view that while human beings did not exist spontaneously, they're a byproduct of created design, that the markets emerge naturally as individuals spontaneously interact with one another, and that spontaneity is deeply connected to something in design, that there is order in the way that we spontaneously interact, and that this is the sort of organic and free byproduct of the human person. Now, I still have a distinct vision of what the human person ought to be acting towards, what the objectives ought to be, what is ultimately the best scenario for social cooperation and human interaction. And this all comes from my belief in both a free and virtuous society, but that markets are not imposed by a central planner, that they are organically existing wherever two human beings exist because of human action. If humans didn't act, then there wouldn't be markets. But because humans act, there are, and because humans act and there are markets, the markets are not therefore created by the state. What some could do, and I had a very good friend interact with me about this by email. I say very good friend, I think very highly of the guy. I think we do disagree on certain things. He's been on the podcast before. I don't have permission to say his name in private email, so I won't. But his view was, I don't understand this because, I really do believe that the state needs to have some fences that they will put around certain things. And the regulatory legitimacy of the state is not the point when I talk about imposition. I believe that the family exists independent of the state, and I do believe the state has a vested interest in enforcing child custody protections, for example. That government intervention is often an overreach and is often needed to be minimized is one thing. That there is a role of institutions in markets is another. And yet, and by the way, the primary issue I would argue is the government removing impediments from free action, not creating impediments to free action. But nevertheless, property rights and enforcement of contracts and enforcement of rule of law, the general construction of the legal parameters we have, I view it as entirely legitimate to say that those things need to be enforced by governmental institutions. But that is very, very different than saying that markets are to be imposed by a central planner. That I would say it goes without words to say it goes. Excuse me. There is just simply no doubt. It goes without saying is the expression I was trying to get to. That markets have frameworks around them that shape them, but that markets themselves are not imposed by the state. And if markets are created by the state, then markets are going, the legitimacy in shaping markets and forming them becomes very, very significant for what the state's level of justifiable interaction is. But because markets are not created by the state, it calls for limiting principles in governmental regulation. It calls for limiting principles in governmental jurisdiction. And so this notion of markets not being imposed, but they just are, is an incredibly important point that is, for me, rooted to a very distinct philosophical and faith-driven reality. I am also not saying or arguing for the supremacy of human autonomy. I'm deriving the legitimacy of human created markets out of human action because of my belief in mankind as created in the image and likeness of God. Markets are created by mankind because mankind was created by God with the self um, interest and preservation instinct and capacity for advancement that is a byproduct of mankind's being made in God's image. These are creational truths. Um, there is an incredible degree of voluntary exchange that stem out of human action. Hayek's terminology of spontaneous order may not be fully cohesive epistemologically if one were to study Hayek, but there's nothing inconsistent with the notion that markets flow out of a certain spontaneous order as long as one understands what that spontaneous order was caused by, which is mankind acting, humans acting. And the second we say that markets are created by the power of the state, we move a legitimacy out of the freedom of the individual to the state that ought to petrify all of us. We hinder economic growth. We hinder economic advancement. We do very bad things for the economy. So this issue matters, and it matters a great deal. I have a few pretty important topics I need to cover in some forthcoming issues, forthcoming episodes of Capital Record. Very excited to bring those to you. But in the meantime, just remember, markets exist because humans act. The state in this side of the fall has a limited jurisdiction in certain regulation and enforcement of contracts and rule of law. The state exists to remove impediments, but not as the creator of markets. They do not, through the power dynamic, become that imposer of markets when you and I are able to do that on our own, as children on the playground have known for years. Thanks for listening to David Bonson's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review. Look forward to another episode here this week.